Hello. Today we're going to talk about the human heart. Why is the human heart very important? We know that the human heart pumps blood, and what does it pump that is found inside the blood? Oxygen. We know that oxygen is needed by every single cell in the body. It's very important that we know about the heart. Now the heart beats between 60 to 100 beats per minute. If it's less than 60 beats per minute, it's called bradycardia, from the word brady, which means slow, cardia, which means heart. On the other hand, if it beats more than 100 beats per minute, it's called tachycardia. What does tachy mean? Tachy means what? Fast. More than 100 beats per minute. So the normal range would be between 60 to 100 beats per minute. On the average, it's around 72 beats per minute. That is approximately, if you multiply that by 60, that's around 4,320 beats per minute. You multiply that by 60, and you have approximately, in one day, you have approximately 103,680 bits in one day. And in 1 year, that's almost 37 million plus of beats per year. So can you imagine the amount of beating or pumping action that the heart does in 1 year? Almost 37 million plus beats per 1 year. Okay, now let's review the parts of the heart, the structures of the heart. As you can see in this particular model here, the heart has 4 chambers. On the right, we have the right atrium, the right ventricle. On the left side, you have the left atrium, and you have the left ventricle. What is found between the right atrium and the right ventricle is the tricuspid valve. What is found between the left atrium and the left ventricle is the mitral valve of the bicuspid valve. Okay? Now we're going back to the valves later. First things first, in the wall of the heart, you have 3 layers. The innermost layer of the heart wall is called the endocardium, followed by the myocardium. What does myo mean? Muscle. And the third layer is called the epicardium. Now what protects the heart? The heart is protected by that membrane called the pericardium. So this pericardium apparently protects the heart. There are 2 parts, the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. The serous pericardium, which is the innermost layer, is made up of 2 parts. The visceral pericardium, which is actually on the surface of the heart, which is basically your epicardium. And then you have your parietal pericardium, which is an outer layer compared to the visceral pericardium. Now, what you call the space between the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium, it's called the pericardial cavity. And because this is a serous membrane, the serous pericardium secretes pericardial fluid, which is found in the pericardial cavity between the 2 layers, the visceral and the parietal pericardium. Now, you might ask me, what is the purpose or function of your pericardial fluid? The pericardial fluid is designed to lubricate so that when the heart pumps blood, it will lessen the amount of friction. So basically, it is able to lubricate when there is pumping action of the heart. Okay, so let's review. First, you have the endocardium, followed by the myocardium, which is the muscle layer, and of course, the third layer is the epicardium, which essentially is your visceral pericardium. Okay, now let's go back to the chambers of the heart. We said this is the right atrium, the right ventricle. And why are there valves? The valves are designed to make the blood flow in one direction, at the same time to prevent backflow of blood. In other words, when the blood is found in the right atrium, when the muscles here contract, they will pump the blood to the right ventricle, passing through the tricuspid valve. So these tricuspid valve, 1, 2, 3 cast, are designed to prevent backflow. Once the blood enters the right ventricle, it should never be allowed to go back. At the same time, it makes the blood flow in one direction. Okay? So that's a tricuspid valve found between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Now, from the right ventricle, the blood goes into the pulmonary trunk via the pulmonary semilunar valve. Again, this particular valve is also designed to prevent backflow. Once the blood enters the pulmonary trunk, it should never be able to go back to the right ventricle. So it prevents backflow at the same time, allows the blood to flow in the one direction towards the pulmonary trunk, which essentially goes into the lung. Now observe, the reason why the color here is blue is because all the blood on the right side of the heart, the right atrium, the right ventricle, pulmonary trunk, they contain deoxygenated blood, which essentially is blood rich in carbon dioxide, which blood came from the either superior vena cava going into the right atrium. The superior vena cava gets all the venous blood from the veins of the head, the neck, and the upper limbs. As you know, the veins will be responsible for getting all the carbon dioxide from all the cells in the head, the neck, and the upper limbs. On the other hand, the blood rich in carbon dioxide from the feet, the leg, the thigh, the thoraco-abdominal pelvic areas will bring the blood via the inferior vena cava over here. Inferior means below, superior means on top. The vena cava are the major blood vessels that are venous blood vessels. They bring the blood into the right atrium, which passes to the tricuspid valve, passes to the right ventricle, and when this is pumped, it is pumped towards the pulmonary trunk via the pulmonary valve. Upon reaching the pulmonary trunk divides into two, the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery here at the back. Okay? So they go to the lung, and what happens in the lung? There's exchange of gases that takes place. You exhale the carbon dioxide, you get rid of it because it's waste, and you bring in what? Oxygen, which is needed by the body. Oxygen is now in the blood, transported by the red blood cells, goes back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. There are two on the left, and there are two on the right. The two pulmonary veins, superior and inferior pulmonary veins, came from the left lung here, and here superior and inferior pulmonary veins came from the right lung. So you will notice this time these pulmonary veins enter the left atrium because it came from the heart, the lungs. Basically, therefore, it now contains oxygenated blood. It passes to the left atrium, passes through the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve, then into the left ventricular chamber. Now observe, of all the chambers in the heart, the left ventricular chamber is the one with the thickest wall because it is the main pump. It pumps the blood towards the aortic valve, which is here, into the aorta here. This is called the ascending aorta, the arch, and the descending aorta. And then the aorta will go down here to become the thoracic aorta. Once it penetrates the diaphragm, it now becomes the abdominal aorta. And the arteries come from the aorta. For example, on the right side here, this is the brachiocephalic. On the left side, you have the left common carotid artery, which brings blood to the neck and to the cerebral arteries of the brain, while the left subclavian, which is this one here, from the word subclave, sub means below the clavicle, it goes down into the armpit, which becomes, the same artery becomes the axillary, because armpit is also known as axilla, and then upon reaching the arm, it's now brachial artery. Okay? So it's the same artery. Subclavian becomes axillary, axillary becomes brachial, and the brachial now divides into your radial and ulnar arteries supplying the forearm and the hand. Okay? So again, that's important to note. Now, let's go back to the heart. Now we said the heart is a muscular pump because of the fact that it has the myocardium, which is a muscle layer. The word contract, muscles can either what? Contract or relax. The type of muscle that you find in the myocardium is called the cardiac muscle. It's not skeletal, which is found in the bones, attached to the bones. It's not the smooth muscle which is found in the wall of your hollow organs, which is the stomach, the small and large intestine. Rather, we call them cardiac muscles, which are involuntary, with single nucleus. That means there's only one nucleus in the cell, and it is slightly striated based on microscopic examination. Okay? Now, being a pump, it needs to be able to, number one, be stimulated by the pacemakers of the heart. The pacemakers of the heart are responsible for the electrical event. In the wall of the right atrium is the SA node, then you have the AV node, then the bundle of His, right bundle branch, and then the left bundle branch, and eventually into the ventricular wall you have the Purkinje fibers. So again, SA node in the wall of the right atrium, and between the right and in the wall in the septum you have the AV node, then you have the bundle of His, which invites you to the right bundle branch and the left bundle branch, and then the Purkinje fibers is responsible for making the ventricular muscles contract, right side and left side. On the other hand, the SA node will be responsible for making the muscles on the left and the right atrium contract at the same time. So when muscles contract, we call that systole, S-Y-S-T-O-L-E. When muscles relax, we call that what? Diastole. Okay? So therefore, it's very important that these pacemakers of the heart are intact in order to make the muscles contract. When these pacemakers are destroyed, then you end up with problems of rhythm. Okay? So it's very important, therefore, we need to know that these chambers of the heart and the walls that they contain, which are myocardium, can only contract in the presence of electrical stimulation coming from the pacemakers of the heart. Okay? It's very important to note that. Now, let's review the electrocardiogram. You probably heard about the electrocardiogram. Okay? With regards to the electrocardiogram, let me write it here. The electrocardiogram okay? ECG stands for electrocardiogram, which means electrical activity of the heart, which is being recorded by an ECG machine. You have, in this typical wave, you have various components. You're familiar with the song A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, and me. We're going to study the ECG. See? So this is the P wave, Q, R, S, T complex, and then the T wave. The P wave represents, as we said, to depolarize means to stimulate with electrical stimulation, atrial depolarization. And if you depolarize the atrium both on the right and the left side with the SA node, it will lead to atrial systole. What does systole mean? Systole means contraction of the muscles. On the other hand, the QRS complex, QRS represents ventricular depolarization. Which essentially leads to ventricular systole, or when the muscles contract. What about the T wave? It's the ventricular repolarization. Which eventually leads to ventricular diastole, or when the muscles relax. So this is just more or less an important discussion on the heart. We are interested to know that the heart is an important muscular pump. We have talked about the chambers of the heart. As we said, there are 4 chambers: right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. We know that the heart is found behind the sternum. We also know that the walls of the heart has 3 layers: the endocardium, the myocardium, and the epicardium. We know that the heart is protected by the pericardium, both the fibrous and the serous pericardium, whereby the serous pericardium is two layers, the visceral and the parietal layer. In between these two layers of the visceral and parietal layers is what we call the pericardial cavity, which contains the pericardial fluid for lubrication. And then finally we'll talk about the blood supply to the heart. As you can clearly see here, the heart, just like any organ in the body, has to have its own blood supply, which came from the aorta, which carries oxygenated blood. As you can clearly see here, the coronary artery, there are two, one on the right, one on the left, is able to bring oxygenated blood to the myocardium. Okay? Because these are made of myocardial cells and myocardial tissues, or cardiac cells. They need oxygen too. They need glucose too. Okay? At the same time, if you have the right and the left coronary arteries, then you have your cardiac veins. You have a vein, you have an artery. The vein carries the deoxygenated blood, or blood rich in carbon dioxide, while the coronary arteries contain the blood rich in oxygen. Now, I have here with me the analogy to an artery. The red represents the artery, while the blue represents the vein. The veins are responsible for getting carbon dioxide from the myocardium, but the arteries are responsible for bringing what? Oxygenated blood. Now, what happens as we get older and we're not careful with the food we eat and we gain weight, and especially if we have a lot of the bad cholesterol called LDL, or low density lipoproteins? The good cholesterol is HDL, or high density lipoproteins. So the bad one called LDL is going to deposit on the wall of the coronary artery, similar to this. Think of this as fat that deposits on the wall. As these deposits are found on the wall of the coronary arteries, what do? They block the flow of blood, basically. They block the flow of blood, and there is decrease in blood flow. It's called ischemia. The perfusion to the myocardium is decreased, and that's the reason why the presence of that fat deposits will cause ischemia, and that's why it's called ischemic heart disease. And people will manifest of chest pain. Severe in nature, behind the sternum, it could radiate to the shoulder, the arm, the forearm, and the hand. That's just ischemia. What happens as time goes by, what happens to the fat deposit? It gets bigger and bigger, like this. And what happens now is that it gets bigger and bigger, it decreases the lumen, or the passageway of the oxygenated blood, and then eventually the blood will slow down and it will form a blood clot, which now completely block the flow of blood. When you have complete obstruction to the flow of blood, the myocardium will die. It's called infarct, or myocardial infarction, which essentially is your heart attack. And that's the one that's life-threatening. So we're going to talk about that in the next video. But today we're just going to talk about the anatomy of the heart. Okay? So that's it. And we'll have a video on the conditions of the heart. Have a good day.